a spider caught in its own web. That was Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus. He was trapped by Hitler's madness at Stalingrad and then re-educated by Stalin's secret police. He spent his final years as a ghost, watched day and night by the Stasi. But this ghost left something behind. In his supposedly secure mansion, Paulus kept one final secret, a hidden cache of documents. When it was finally uncovered, the discovery raised questions so profound that the evidence had to be permanently destroyed. The end of the Sixth Army. The winter of 1943 was a graveyard of steel and silence. The once proud Sixth Army, numbering over 300,000 men, was trapped in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. It had become a living monument to defeat. You see, thousands of soldiers perished in frozen cellars or starved in the snow, while artillery shells fell like judgment from above. At the center of it all stood a man who had once been the symbol of German precision and discipline. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus. Until that moment, Paulus's rise through the ranks had been defined by order and control. He was a staff officer, a strategist, a man of tidy reports and calculated movements. But Stalingrad was pure chaos, and no amount of planning could fix what the Eastern Front had become. The encirclement by Soviet forces cut off supplies, hope, and communication. It was, to put it mildly, a hopeless situation. Still, Hitler demanded that Paulus hold the city at all costs. As the temperature fell far below zero, those costs became unthinkable. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. But this wasn't a gift. The thing nobody tells you is, this was a dark message. No German field marshal in history had ever surrendered. The implication was clear. Paulus was expected to end his own life rather than face capture. But Paulus, gaunt and exhausted, refused to end his life for a dictator he had begun to doubt. The very next day, he surrendered to the Red Army. When the news reached Berlin, it was treated as treason. But to those who saw Paulus's haunted eyes as he stepped out of the rubble, it was not betrayal. It was survival. He instantly became the highest-ranking German officer ever captured alive. What no one knew then was that his decision would not only change his own fate, it would set in motion a sequence of events that would follow him for the rest of his life, all the way to a quiet street in Dresden. The Soviets, you see, recognized his value immediately. He was not just a prisoner, he was an opportunity. They studied, and over the years of captivity that followed, something inside Paulus shifted. By the time he appeared at the Nuremberg trials in 1946, testifying against his former comrades, the transformation was complete. The once loyal servant of Hitler's army now spoke as a witness for the Allies. His voice was calm, but his words were devastating. It was as if Stalingrad had shattered not just his army, but his entire belief system. Yet even then, whispers surrounded him. Some said he had been re-educated. Others insisted he was merely playing a role to stay alive. His years in the Soviet Union were marked by a strange duality, privileged captivity under close watch. He was housed comfortably, guarded politely, and kept far away from the public eye. The Soviets wanted him alive but silent, useful but contained. By the early 1950s, when Stalin's passing shifted the tides of policy, Paulus was finally allowed to return to German soil. But it wasn't the Germany he had known. He was sent to East Germany, to the city of Dresden, still scarred by fire and war. The authorities gave him a villa on Preußstrasse. To the world, it looked like a gesture of respect. To those who understood the politics of the time, it was more like a gilded cage. The Stasi, the dreaded East German secret police, watched him closely, recording who visited and what was said. Inside that grand villa, surrounded by microphones and suspicion, Friedrich Paulus lived out his final years as both a symbol and a shadow of Germany's collapse. What he left behind after he passed away in 1957 would take years to come to light. And when officials entered his house, they found more than personal belongings. They found traces of a life entangled with the secrets of two regimes, and a mystery that continues to whisper from the quiet walls of his Dresden mansion. But his capture was just the beginning of a much darker story. The Moscow transformation. When Friedrich Paulus was taken into Soviet custody, he was not thrown into a cell. He was quietly escorted to a compound far from the front. He was, after all, the biggest prize of the war. The Red Army didn't need to humiliate him, they needed to use him. At first, Paulus kept his silence. He refused to collaborate. But as weeks turned into months and months into years, the walls of pride began to erode. The Soviets were patient. They knew that time and isolation could break even the strongest convictions. When they brought him news of Hitler's reaction to his surrender, how the Führer called him a disgrace to Germany, it struck a wound deeper than any interrogation could. That was the turning point. The man who lived by loyalty found himself cast out, and in that loneliness, the Soviets saw their opening. Paulus was moved to a facility near Moscow. There, he began to receive books, reports, and carefully chosen visitors. Soviet officers debated him, and German communists exiled to Moscow appealed to his conscience. Slowly, they introduced him to a new narrative, that Hitler had betrayed Germany, not saved it. But here's the kicker. They didn't just break him, they recruited him. He joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, or NKFD. This was a Soviet-backed group of captured German officers. Soon, Paulus's voice was being broadcast over radio waves back to the German front lines, urging his former soldiers to lay down their arms and turn against Hitler. To put it mildly, his former comrades were stunned. This was, in their eyes, the ultimate act of treason. Was it a genuine belief or quiet survival? That question would haunt his reputation forever. By 1946, the transformation was complete enough for the Soviets to bring him to Nuremberg. What many overlooked was that he wasn't a defendant. He was a witness for the prosecution. When he entered the courtroom, the world saw a ghost. His face was thin, his uniform replaced by a simple civilian suit. He spoke methodically, describing German operations at Stalingrad and confirming details of Hitler's military interference. His testimony shook the room. After Nuremberg, the Soviets didn't release him. They relocated him to a guarded residence outside Moscow, where he lived under constant observation. He was allowed to write letters, but only under supervision. His family, living in West Germany, was unreachable. It was during this period that Soviet historians began to take an interest in his writings, his tactical sketches, notes, and memoranda from the war. Then, in 1953, everything changed. Stalin passed away. The new Soviet leadership wanted to appear more cooperative. Among the gestures of goodwill was the decision to repatriate a number of prominent German prisoners. Paulus's name was on that list. But instead of being sent to his home in West Germany, he was directed to the east, to the German Democratic Republic. It was there, in the ruins of Dresden, that the Soviets planned to use him one last time. He was to serve as a living example of conversion. He was sent to a gilded cage where the walls had ears. Watched by the Stasi. When Friedrich Paulus arrived in Dresden in 1953, the city still looked like a wound that had refused to heal. Yet amid the ruins, the East German government offered Paulus a home, a grand villa overlooking the Elbe River. But this was controlled hospitality. The property was immediately given a code name by the Ministry for State Security, the Stasi. It was called Object Terrace, and every single corner was wired. We're talking microphones hidden in the lamps, listening devices in the walls, and agents posing as gardeners and housekeepers. The phone lines were tapped. Plainclothes agents were stationed nearby around the clock, logging every single person who entered or left the premises. This was a full-blown surveillance state focused on one aging man. To most of Dresden, Paulus had become a ghost of the past. People knew where he lived, but few dared to visit. His name still carried the weight of Stalingrad, half tragedy, half treason. Former officers refused contact. Western journalists who requested interviews were always denied. And yet, behind the tall gates, he maintained the routines of a soldier. He rose early, kept meticulous notes, and arranged his desk as if expecting an inspection. Neighbors often saw him walking alone, his figure straight but slow, his expression unreadable. Officially, he was retired. Unofficially, he was a prisoner in plain sight. Inside the villa, the walls themselves seemed to keep secrets. Paulus had a small study on the upper floor overlooking the river, where he spent hours writing letters. But here's the thing. The Stasi read every single one before they were or weren't sent. They monitored not just his calls, but his private conversations at home. "Object terrace is secure," one report stated dryly, as if describing a fortress. Despite the restrictions, Paulus remained outwardly calm. Those few who spoke with him in his final years described a man still burdened by guilt. He read military history, collected maps, and corresponded with former colleagues in cautious, filtered letters. There were whispers, though, circulating among East German officers. Rumors that Paulus had hidden personal notes and wartime records within the villa's walls. A few even believed he had been keeping private, uncensored correspondence with Soviet officers, letters that contradicted the official narrative of his conversion. The Stasi heard the rumors, but as long as Paulus was alive, they could only watch and wait. When he passed in 1957, the Stasi finally made their move. What was in the boxes? In the weeks following Friedrich Paulus's death in February 1957, the villa on Preußstraße was sealed. The obituary in East German newspapers was short and dry. There was no mention of Stalingrad and certainly no mention of the surveillance. By late spring, a small group of Stasi officers arrived. Officially, their task was simple: catalog his belongings for state archives. Unofficially, the order came from higher up. They were to search the house thoroughly and recover any materials of ideological or political value. That vague phrasing meant one thing: they were looking for secrets. The agents began their work. The study was neat, the shelves filled with history books and old Soviet gifts. But in the back of the upstairs study, behind a tall, heavy bookshelf, they found something that stopped them cold. A narrow, locked door hidden behind a sliding panel. The hinges were old and the keyhole had been filled with wax. This wasn't just storage, this was a vault. What they found inside is the reason historians are still speechless. The air was still, heavy with the smell of paper. Stacked in that concealed room were boxes of handwritten notes, maps, and sealed envelopes bearing Soviet insignia. This was not the collection of a simple retiree. There were files on German officers who had surrendered at Stalingrad. There were letters written in Paulus's careful hand, some addressed to Soviet officials, others to his family, drafts that had clearly never been mailed. And then there was the most explosive item. According to reports that surfaced years later, one of the Stasi officers described finding drafts of speeches never delivered. One, incredibly, was a statement denouncing both Hitler and Stalin. This was political dynamite in 1957. The materials were quickly confiscated, sealed, and transferred to a restricted section of the archives in Berlin. None of it was ever made public. One Stasi officer described the discovery as a politically sensitive collection. The materials were deemed so volatile that the officers who handled them were reassigned, and within weeks all references to the Paulus file disappeared from Stasi records. What was in those documents? The question didn't just puzzle historians, it left them utterly speechless. The contents of that hidden room became a breeding ground for rampant speculation. Rumors claimed the papers contained evidence that Paulus was playing a dangerous double game. They whispered he had continued to correspond with powerful Soviet generals in total secret long after his capture. What were they discussing? What loyalties did he truly hold? Others insisted the files were even more explosive. They whispered that the meticulous Paulus had kept copies of his original raw interrogations. These weren't the sanitized official stories, they were the real transcripts, the ones that directly contradicted the public narrative of his sudden conversion to the Soviet cause. Was his entire defection a carefully constructed sham? A few even suggested a darker secret. They hinted the hidden room contained coded notes, a hidden ledger. These notes allegedly linked high-ranking Soviet officers to wartime actions the regime had buried. Brutal, inconvenient truths the world was never meant to know. What do you think was in those files? Was Paulus a master spy, a true convert, or just a pawn in a bigger game? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more hidden stories.